Last time, we stopped at year 3, $18,240. The flat stretch, the stalled car being pushed with almost nothing to show for it yet. Here's a question worth sitting with before we go further. If the first $18,000 took 3 years and felt like almost nothing, how long do you think the next $82,000 takes? Meera is 37. It's a Sunday afternoon, and she's doing something she rarely does anymore, actually looking closely at the account, instead of glancing and closing it. The number is $118,600. She doesn't say anything out loud. There's nobody else in the room to say it to anyway. But she scrolls back through the account history, further than she usually bothers to, watching the balance climb in slow motion across 7 years of the same Tuesday and the same Sunday, over and over, until the shape of it stops looking random and starts looking like something closer to a pattern. 7 years of the same $100 then more monthly automation. 7 years of a system she built once and mostly stopped thinking about. And she sits there, doing quiet math in her head, trying to understand how the last 4 years added more than 6 times what the first 3 years did, using contributions that didn't grow nearly that much. There's a name for the specific stretch she just finished. This channel has called it the hardest climb. And today I want to show you exactly why it's the hardest, and exactly why it's the last time it will ever be this hard. My name is Nick, and I spend a probably unhealthy amount of time thinking about money. We've followed Meera from a leaking bucket to an automated system to 3 years of a flat, discouraging stretch that felt like almost nothing was happening. Today she crosses $100,000, a number on this channel flagged a long time ago as the hardest climb in the entire journey to real wealth. And I want to show you why that's true mathematically, not just as a nice phrase, because understanding why it was hard is exactly what tells you it's never going to be quite this hard again. Here's the assumption most people carry into this stretch of building wealth: that progress should feel roughly linear, that the second $50,000 should feel as hard to reach as the first $50,000. It's a reasonable assumption on paper. The return rate doesn't change. The percentage this year is the same percentage as last year and the year before that. If the rate is constant, shouldn't the difficulty be constant too? It doesn't. Reaching your first $100,000 requires almost entirely manual labor, your own contributions doing nearly all of the work, month after month, with the market's contribution still small in absolute terms even though the percentage return hasn't changed at all. It is, dollars for dollars, the hardest stretch most people will ever climb. Let's actually look at Meera's 7 years, because the shape of this climb is more interesting than the final number. In year 1, her contributions did almost all of the work. The market added a rounding error on top of what she put in by hand. By year 3, at $18,240, the ratio had barely shifted. Her own money was still doing roughly 5 times more work than the market's growth. But something changes in the years between $18,000 and $100,000 that doesn't feel like it's changing while it's happening. At a typical long-run average return, the market's contribution to a $100,000 account in a single year is now large enough to roughly match what Meera puts in from her own paycheck across several months. Not because anything about the return rate changed, because the base for the return applies to finally get large enough for the same percentage to produce a meaningfully larger number. Think of it like climbing a steep hill. The first 100 feet of elevation take everything you have, your legs, your lungs, all of it, for very little visible height gained. But you're not just gaining heights, you're gaining a position. And a climber positioned higher up the same hill covers more vertical distance per step than a climber still near the bottom, using the exact same amount of effort. Meera didn't climb faster in years 4 through 7. She climbed from higher up. The effort was identical. The ground underneath it was not. Put actual numbers next to that idea, and it stops being an abstraction. At $18,000, a typical year's market return added roughly $1,200 to Meera's balance. Noticeable, but nowhere near what her own contributions added that same year. At $118,000, that same kind of return year adds something closer to $8,000 to $9,000, money that shows up in the account without a single additional contribution, purely because the base it's calculated against finally got large enough to matter. Same market, the same percentage, a completely different number is attached to it. This is why $100,000 is, dollar for dollars, the hardest climb most people ever make. Nearly every dollar of it had to be earned and contributed by hand, at a point in the climb where the mountain wasn't yet doing much of the work. And it's exactly why the next $100,000 will take meaningfully less time than this one did, using the same monthly habit that got her here. Now I want to pause here because there's an objection forming. Nick, if the market's contribution is finally catching up, doesn't that mean Meera can relax a little? Ease off the monthly amount now that the machine is helping more? That instinct is understandable. It's also, I think, exactly backwards, and it's the single most common mistake people make right at this specific milestone. Here's what actually threatens Meera at $100,000, and it isn't a market downturn. It's a specific, quiet temptation that only shows up once the account finally looks like it's doing something on its own. Crossing this milestone can feel like permission to slow down, as if reaching the hardest part of the climb means the rest handles itself from here. It doesn't. The years right after $100,000 are exactly when contributions and market growth start compounding on top of each other. And that combination is where the largest, most dramatic wealth-building years of the entire process actually happen. Have you ever worked hard toward a milestone, reached it, and immediately felt the urge to ease off, right at the exact moment easing off would cost you the most? It's a strange instinct when you actually look at it directly. Nobody would run the first 6 miles of a 7-mile hike at full effort and then decide to slow down right as the trail finally started sloping downhill in their favor. But that's essentially what easing off at $118,600 amounts to, slowing down exactly when gravity, or in this case compounding, finally started doing more of the work. James Clear writes about this in Atomic Habits, that small, consistent actions compound in a way that's nearly invisible day to day, and that the temptation to abandon a system right as it starts producing visible results is one of the most common ways people quietly sabotage years of prior effort. Slowing down the moment the hill finally starts helping isn't caution. It's giving up the exact advantage that 7 years of climbing just earned her. So, what does Meera actually do differently at $118,600? Almost nothing about the system, and one important thing about her expectations. The habit that got her here, the same automated contribution, untouched, unqueried, is the exact habit that gets her through the next climb, which will be measurably shorter. Using the rule of 72 at a typical long-run average of around 7%, a given balance roughly doubles in about 10 years left completely untouched. The honest, useful shift is this. Meera stops measuring her progress by how the climb feels and starts trusting what the math already told her back at year 3, that the flat stretch was never a sign of failure, and this milestone isn't a finish line to relax at. It's the exact point where the mountain starts doing more of the carrying. There's a version of this milestone that quietly derails people, and it's worth naming honestly. Some climbers reach exactly this point, look back at how far they've come, and start treating the achievement itself as the finish line, celebrating with a lifestyle upgrade that permanently increases what they need every month, right at the moment their money was finally about to start doing more of the carrying. The climb doesn't reward that kind of celebration. It rewards the same boring habit, left running for a few more years than most people have the patience for. It's worth being honest about what the next stretch actually looks like too, so this doesn't sound like an empty promise. The acceleration isn't instant or dramatic, it's gradual, compounding quietly on top of the same monthly contribution Meera has been making since year 1. Somewhere in the years just ahead of her, without any single dramatic moment marking the change, the balance she's building will cross the point this channel has called the actual alpha insight, the moment annual growth from the market alone starts to rival and then exceed what she's contributing by hand. That's a different milestone entirely, further up the same hill. This one, the hardest climb, was simply the price of admission to reach it. Remember the temptation from a few minutes ago, the pull to ease off right when the hill finally started helping. Here's what Meera actually builds instead of giving it. She doesn't change the contribution, she doesn't renegotiate the automation. What she changes is her relationship to the climb itself, from someone straining against the hill to someone increasingly carried by it, without ever having to consciously decide when that shift happens. The habit stays identical. What the habit is now working alongside is what's different. This is the same principle this channel has come back to since the very first $100 Meera ever invested. The system doesn't need her full attention to keep compounding. It needed her full attention to get built. Now it needs her patience, and increasingly little else. The 7 years of manual labor that got her to $118,600 were never meant to repeat themselves at the same intensity forever. They were meant to end, quietly, right about here. So, back to that Sunday afternoon, $118,600. 7 years of the same habit, applied to ground that quietly became steeper in her favor without her fully noticing. Here's what I want you to take from Meera's hardest climb. The first $100,000 asked nearly everything of her, dollar for dollars, because the mountain wasn't yet carrying much of the weight. That's not a flaw in the plan. That's simply what the hardest part of any climb actually costs. Somewhere in the last 7 years, without any single moment marking it, she stopped being someone who was trying to save money and became someone who simply does. The habit outlasted the motivation that started it, which is usually how the ones that actually work end up surviving long enough to matter. She doesn't ease off the automation tonight. The habit that carried her up the steepest part of the hill is the same habit that's about to be carried, increasingly, by the hill itself. She closes the notebook, and this time she does write one line, not a big one, just an observation worth keeping. 7 years for the first 100,000. She doesn't yet know exactly how much shorter the next one will be. But she's stopped needing to know the exact number before trusting that it will be shorter. And somewhere further up this same climb, at a number she hasn't reached yet, the mountain finishes taking over completely. So, I want to ask you something. If you've crossed your own version of a hardest climb, whatever the number was for you, did you keep the same habit going afterward, or did you ease off right when it mattered most? Drop it in the comments. And if this helped, subscribe. Because next time, we finally arrive at the number this channel built its name on, the exact moment the machine stops being Meera's project and starts being her partner. $650,000. That's next. I'll see you there.